Sarah Martinez had been working as a flight attendant for Malaysian Airlines for 8 years. At 32, she had seen it all: crying babies, drunk passengers, medical emergencies, and even a few marriage proposals at 30,000 feet. But nothing could have prepared her for what would happen on flight MH17 that summer day in July 2014. The morning started like any other. Sarah woke up in her Amsterdam hotel room at 5:30 a.m., showered, and put on her crisp blue uniform. She had been assigned to work the business class section on the Boeing 777 bound for Kuala Lumpur. It was supposed to be a routine 13-hour flight, the kind she had done hundreds of times before. At the airport, Sarah met her crew for the briefing. Captain Eugene Chu was an experienced pilot with over 15,000 flight hours. First, Officer Ahmad Hakimi was younger but equally competent. The cabin crew consisted of 12 attendants, including Sarah, who had become close friends over the years. They joked about their weekend plans and discussed the passenger manifest: 298 souls on board, including families returning from vacations and business travelers heading to Southeast Asia. The Boeing 777 was loaded with fuel and supplies. Sarah did her usual safety checks in the business cabin, making sure the emergency equipment was in place and the seats were properly adjusted. She had memorized every procedure, every safety protocol. Her job was to make passengers comfortable while keeping them safe. It seemed simple enough. As passengers began boarding, Sarah noticed a mix of nationalities: Dutch families, Malaysian businessmen, Australian tourists, and researchers heading to an AIDS conference in Melbourne. There were children excited about their journey, elderly couples holding hands, and young professionals buried in their laptops. Everyone had plans, dreams, people waiting for them at their destination. Among the passengers, Sarah particularly noticed a family with 3 young children. The mother seemed nervous about flying, so Sarah spent extra time explaining the safety features and reassuring her that the flight would be smooth. The father thanked her repeatedly, mentioning it was their first family vacation abroad. Their youngest daughter, maybe 5 years old, gave Sarah a drawing of an airplane with smiling faces in the windows. Another passenger that caught her attention was Dr. Willem Lang, a kind elderly man traveling to the AIDS conference. He had devoted his life to medical research and was excited about presenting his latest findings. He showed Sarah pictures of his grandchildren and talked about how this conference might help save lives around the world. The flight took off from Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport at 12:15 p.m. local time. As they climbed to cruising altitude, Sarah served drinks and meals to her passengers. The atmosphere was relaxed and friendly. Children played with their toys, adults read books or watched movies, and some passengers had already fallen asleep. Sarah loved this part of long flights, the peaceful hours when everything ran smoothly. She would walk through the aisles, checking on passengers, refilling drinks, and sometimes chatting with those who couldn't sleep. Flying had always felt magical to her. Being suspended between earth and sky, watching clouds drift past the windows, seeing the curve of the planet below, it never got old. As they flew over Germany and into Eastern European airspace, Sarah was preparing for the meal service. The galley was busy with her colleagues heating food and arranging trays. They laughed about a passenger in economy who had already asked for 3 extra meals, and another who insisted on keeping his window shade open because he was collecting clouds. The flight was progressing exactly as planned. They were maintaining altitude at 33,000 feet, following their assigned route through Ukrainian airspace. The weather was clear, visibility was perfect, and all systems were functioning normally. Captain Chu had announced they would arrive in Kuala Lumpur on schedule. Sarah was arranging lunch trays when she heard a conversation between 2 passengers about the situation in Ukraine. There had been news reports about conflict in the region, but commercial airlines had been assured that civilian aircraft flying at high altitudes were safe. The airspace was open, and hundreds of flights passed through this route every month without incident. At 4:20 p.m. local time, Sarah was walking through the business cabin, collecting empty glasses and checking on passengers. The 5-year-old girl who had given her the drawing was sleeping peacefully against her mother's shoulder. Dr. Lang was reviewing his conference presentation on his tablet. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Then, in an instant, everything changed. Sarah felt a massive impact that threw her against the cabin wall. The aircraft shuddered violently, and she heard a sound unlike anything she had experienced in her 8 years of flying, a thunderous explosion that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The lights flickered, oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, and suddenly the cabin was filled with rushing wind and debris. Her training kicked in immediately. Despite her confusion and fear, Sarah's muscle memory took over. She grabbed the nearest intercom and tried to contact the cockpit, but there was only static. The aircraft was shaking violently, and she could see through the windows that they were losing altitude rapidly. Passengers were screaming and crying. The peaceful cabin had transformed into chaos in seconds. Sarah moved through the aisle, trying to help people put on their oxygen masks and fasten their seatbelts, even as she struggled to understand what was happening to their aircraft. The explosion came without warning. One moment Sarah was collecting lunch trays, and the next she was fighting to stay upright as the aircraft lurched violently to one side. The Boeing 777 had been struck by a surface-to-air missile fired from rebel-controlled territory in eastern Ukraine, though nobody on board knew this yet. What Sarah witnessed next would haunt her for the rest of her life. The missile had torn through the aircraft's structure, causing catastrophic damage to the fuselage and flight controls. The plane was breaking apart at 33,000 feet, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Through the chaos, Sarah could hear Captain Chu's voice over the intercom, strained but professional, trying to maintain control. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing severe technical difficulties. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." But even as he spoke, Sarah could tell from the aircraft's violent movements that the situation was far beyond any technical problem. The cabin pressure was dropping rapidly. Oxygen masks had deployed, but the rushing wind made it difficult for passengers to secure them properly. Sarah moved through the business section, helping terrified passengers with their masks, while fighting against the decompression that was pulling everything toward the gaping holes in the fuselage. The family with 3 children was crying and holding each other. The mother was trying to put oxygen masks on her kids while tears streamed down her face. Sarah reached them and helped secure the youngest daughter's mask, the same little girl who had drawn the airplane picture. The child looked at Sarah with wide, frightened eyes and asked, "Are we going to be okay?" Sarah forced herself to smile despite her own terror. "Hold your mommy tight, sweetheart," she said, her voice barely audible over the roaring wind. It was all she could manage to say, because she knew the truth. They were not going to be okay. Dr. Lang, the elderly researcher, was sitting calmly in his seat with his oxygen mask on, still clutching his tablet with his conference presentation. He looked at Sarah and nodded, as if to say he understood what was happening. There was a strange peace in his eyes, the resignation of a man who had lived a full life and was facing its end with dignity. Sarah tried to reach the cockpit to check on the pilots, but the aircraft was tilting at such a steep angle that moving through the aisles had become nearly impossible. Through the cockpit door's window, she could see Captain Chu and First Officer Hakimi working frantically with the controls, but the aircraft was no longer responding to their commands. The Boeing 777 was in a death spiral, pieces of debris flying past the windows as it broke apart. Sarah realized with horrible clarity that they were going to crash, and there was nothing she or anyone else could do to prevent it. Her 8 years of training, all the safety procedures she had memorized, all the emergency scenarios she had practiced, none of it mattered now. Other crew members were trying to calm passengers and maintain some semblance of order, but panic was spreading through the cabin. Some people were praying, others were calling loved ones on their phones, desperately trying to get a signal. A businessman in seat 4A was frantically typing what looked like a goodbye message to his family. Sarah thought about her own family, her parents in Kuala Lumpur, her younger brother who was studying engineering, her boyfriend David who worked as a pilot for a different airline. She had texted David that morning before takeoff, as she always did, telling him she loved him and would see him when she got home. Now she wished she had said more, wished she had told him how much their relationship meant to her. The aircraft's descent was becoming more violent. Luggage was flying around the cabin, and Sarah could hear the groaning of metal as the plane's structure continued to fail. Through the windows, she could see they were getting closer to the ground. The Ukrainian countryside was rushing up toward them at an impossible speed. In what she thought might be her final moments, Sarah made a decision that would define her character. Instead of collapsing in panic or trying to save herself, she continued, moving through the cabin, comforting passengers and helping them prepare for impact. She held the hand of an elderly woman who was traveling alone, sat with a teenage boy whose parents were in economy class, and helped a young mother protect her baby. Sarah found herself thinking about all the flights she had worked, all the passengers she had served over the years. She had always taken pride in making people feel safe and comfortable while they traveled. Flying had been her passion, her calling. Even now, as everything was falling apart around her, she couldn't abandon the people in her care. The last thing Sarah remembered before impact was the face of the 5-year-old girl, still clutching her mother's hand. The child had stopped crying and was looking directly at Sarah with those innocent eyes. In that moment, Sarah whispered a prayer she hadn't said since childhood, asking for mercy, for peace, for some miracle that she knew would not come. The Boeing 777, carrying 298 innocent people, crashed into a sunflower field in eastern Ukraine at 4:26 p.m. local time. The impact was devastating and instantaneous. There were no survivors. But this story is not just about the tragedy of Flight MH17. It's about the courage, compassion, and professionalism that Sarah Martinez displayed in her final moments, and how her actions reflected the best of humanity, even in the face of unimaginable horror. The sunflower field in eastern Ukraine fell silent after the thunderous crash. Pieces of the Boeing 777 were scattered across several square kilometers, mixed with personal belongings, luggage, and the remnants of lives that had been abruptly cut short. Local farmers who witnessed the explosion from a distance were the first to reach the crash site, but there was nothing they could do except stare in horror at the devastation. Within hours, news of the tragedy began spreading around the world. Flight MH17 had been shot down by a Russian-made Buk missile system, operated by pro-Russian separatists who had mistaken the civilian aircraft for a Ukrainian military transport plane. The missile had detonated just meters from the cockpit, instantly killing the pilots and causing the aircraft to break apart in mid-air. In Kuala Lumpur, Sarah's parents, Carmen and Roberto Martinez, were preparing dinner when they saw the breaking news on television. At first, they didn't pay much attention. Airline disasters seemed like distant tragedies that happened to other people. Then they saw the flight number, MH17. Carmen dropped the plate she was holding and it shattered on the kitchen floor just as their world was shattering around them. Roberto immediately called Malaysian Airlines, but the phone lines were jammed with calls from other desperate families. They drove to the airport, where a crisis center had been hastily set up in a conference room. Hundreds of family members were gathering, clutching photos of their loved ones, hoping against hope for some miracle that would never come. David Chen, Sarah's boyfriend and fellow pilot, was flying a domestic route when his airline informed him of the tragedy. He had to complete his flight before he could fully process the news, maintaining his professional composure while passengers around him remained unaware that his world had just collapsed. When he finally landed and checked his phone, he found Sarah's morning text message still there. "Flying to KL today. Love you. See you soon." The international investigation began immediately, but it would take years to fully piece together what happened. Dutch investigators led the effort since most of the passengers were Dutch citizens. They had to work in a war zone, with armed guards protecting them as they collected evidence from the crash site. Every fragment of debris, every personal item, every piece of the aircraft had to be carefully cataloged and analyzed. Sarah's body was found still wearing her blue Malaysian Airlines uniform, her crew badge still pinned to her jacket. The investigators noted in their report that she had been found near several passengers, suggesting she had been helping them even in the aircraft's final moments. Her name was added to the official list of crew members who had died in the line of duty. The families of the victims faced an agonizing wait for answers. Carmen Martinez spent weeks calling government officials, airline representatives, and anyone who might have information about what happened to her daughter. She refused to believe Sarah was gone until she could hold her daughter's belongings in her hands, until she could see some physical proof of what had occurred. International outrage grew as evidence mounted that the aircraft had been deliberately targeted. The United Nations called for a full investigation, and several countries imposed sanctions on Russia for its role in supplying weapons to the separatists. But for the families, political responses felt hollow compared to their overwhelming grief. Dr. Willem Lang's research colleagues held a memorial service at the AIDS conference he never reached. They dedicated the entire conference to the memory of those lost on flight MH17, saying that the passengers had been traveling to help make the world a better place, only to have their lives cut short by an act of senseless violence. The 5-year-old girl who had given Sarah the airplane drawing was identified as Emma Bakker, traveling with her parents and siblings for a family vacation in Asia. Her drawing was found among the debris, somehow surviving the crash. The Dutch authorities returned it to her extended family, who kept it as one of the few tangible memories they had left of Emma's joy and innocence. Malaysian Airlines struggled to cope with the disaster, which came just months after the mysterious disappearance of flight MH370. The company faced lawsuits, investigations, and a crisis of public confidence. Many employees, especially cabin crew, questioned whether they could continue flying, knowing that their jobs could put them in the path of such random violence. Sarah's crew colleagues organized a memorial service at Kuala Lumpur International Airport. They placed flowers and photos near the departure gate where flight MH17 had originated its journey. Many of Sarah's friends spoke about her dedication to passenger safety and her warm personality. They remembered how she always volunteered for difficult flights and how she had a gift for calming nervous passengers. The crash site in Ukraine became a temporary memorial, with flowers, teddy bears, and personal messages left by visitors. Local residents, despite living in a war zone, showed remarkable compassion in protecting and preserving the victims' belongings until investigators could collect them. Many said they felt personally responsible for honoring the memory of these innocent people who had died on their land. Insurance companies began the complex process of compensating families, but no amount of money could fill the void left by the victims. Carmen and Roberto Martinez received Sarah's final paycheck and her employee benefits, along with official condolences from the airline. The documents felt surreal, bureaucratic acknowledgments of a life that had meant everything to them. David kept Sarah's apartment exactly as she had left it for months after the crash. Her uniform was still hanging in the closet, her flight manuals were stacked on the bedside table, and her passport was sitting on the kitchen counter where she had left it after her previous trip. Eventually, he had to accept that she was never coming home, but he couldn't bring himself to pack away her belongings. The investigation into flight MH17 became one of the most complex and politically charged aviation inquiries in history. The Dutch Safety Board led the technical investigation, while a separate criminal investigation was conducted by the Joint Investigation Team, consisting of prosecutors from the Netherlands, Australia, Belgium, Malaysia, and Ukraine. Investigators faced unprecedented challenges. The crash site was located in an active war zone, controlled by pro-Russian separatists who were suspected of causing the tragedy. Access was limited and dangerous, with ongoing fighting making it impossible to secure the area properly. International monitors and investigators had to negotiate with armed militias just to reach the debris field. The first breakthrough came from analyzing radar data and communications intercepts. Ukrainian authorities provided recordings of phone calls between separatist commanders, discussing the movement of a Buk missile system into the area on the day of the crash. In one chilling conversation, a rebel leader was heard saying they had shot down a plane, initially celebrating what they thought was a Ukrainian military transport. Peter Van Vliet, a Dutch air accident investigator with 20 years of experience, was assigned as lead technical analyst for the MH17 case. He had worked on dozens of crash investigations, but nothing had prepared him for the emotional weight of this tragedy. Every piece of debris told a story, he would later recall. We weren't just investigating a mechanical failure or pilot error. We were documenting a war crime. The painstaking process of reconstructing the aircraft began in a hangar in the Baito, Netherlands. Investigators collected thousands of fragments from the crash site, carefully mapping their original positions on the plane. They discovered distinctive damage patterns that could only have been caused by high-energy objects striking the aircraft from outside. The signature of a missile explosion. Forensic analysis of Sarah Martinez's crew station showed that she had been thrown against the cabin wall by the initial blast, but had survived long enough to move through the aircraft helping passengers. Investigators found her body near passengers who were not in her assigned work area, confirming witness accounts that she had been assisting people during the aircraft's final moments. The criminal investigation team, led by Dutch prosecutor Fred Westerbeck, worked to identify the specific individuals responsible for firing the missile. Using intercepted communications, satellite imagery, and social media posts, they traced the movement of the Buk missile system from Russia into Ukraine and back again after the attack. Westerbeck's team discovered that the missile system had been operated by a crew that included both Russian military personnel and local separatists. The evidence showed a direct command structure linking the attack to Russian military intelligence, though Russia continued to deny any involvement and offered various alternative theories that investigators systematically debunked. One of the most emotionally difficult aspects of the investigation was analyzing the victims' personal effects. Every wallet, every piece of jewelry, every family photo found in the debris had to be cataloged and eventually returned to families. The investigators found Emma Backer's drawing of the airplane in Sarah's possession, suggesting the flight attendant had kept it with her during the crisis. Dr. Willem Lange's research materials were scattered across the crash site, but investigators managed to recover his tablet and several research papers he had been planning to present at the AIDS conference. His colleagues later published his work posthumously, ensuring that his final contribution to medical science would not be lost with his life. The investigation revealed disturbing details about how civilian aircraft had unknowingly been flying through a war zone. While commercial flights were prohibited from flying below 32,000 feet over eastern Ukraine, the Buk missile system was capable of reaching altitudes well above that limit. Flight MH17 had been following a standard international air route that was considered safe. Carmen Martinez traveled to the Netherlands multiple times during the investigation, desperate for answers about her daughter's final moments. The investigators showed her the reconstructed section of the aircraft where Sarah had been working, explaining how the missile's explosion had instantly depressurized the cabin and damaged flight controls. They assured her that Sarah's death, like those of all passengers and crew, had been quick. The investigation also uncovered evidence of a broader pattern of Russian military involvement in the Ukrainian conflict. The Buk system that shot down MH17 was traced to the Russian 53rd Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade, based in Kursk. Phone intercepts revealed that Russian military personnel had been directly involved in operating air defense systems in separatist-controlled territory. International arrest warrants were issued for 4 men suspected of having key roles in transporting and deploying the missile system: Russians Igor Girkin, Sergei Dubinsky, and Oleg Pulatov, along with Ukrainian Leonid Karchenko. Russia refused to extradite any of its citizens, and the suspects remained at large, protected by the Russian government. The technical investigation concluded that Flight MH17 had been shot down by a 9M38 Buk missile fired from agricultural land near the village of Pervomaisky in eastern Ukraine. The missile had detonated just above and to the left of the cockpit, sending hundreds of metal fragments through the aircraft at high velocity. The damage had been so severe that the pilots would have been killed instantly, and the aircraft had broken apart within seconds. For David Chen, reading the investigation reports was both necessary and torturous. He needed to understand what had happened to Sarah, but the technical details of the aircraft's destruction forced him to confront the violent reality of her death. The investigators' conclusion that the crew and passengers had died quickly provided some comfort, but couldn't ease the fundamental injustice of her loss. The investigation's final report, released in 2016, was unequivocal. Flight MH17 had been shot down by a Russian-made missile system operated by pro-Russian forces, with direct support from the Russian military. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, documented in thousands of pages of technical analysis, forensic evidence, and intercepted communications. In March 2020, nearly 6 years after the tragedy, the trial of 4 men accused of murder in connection with the downing of Flight MH17 began at the District Court of The Hague. It was a historic moment, the first time an international criminal court would try suspects for shooting down a civilian aircraft during an armed conflict. The courtroom was packed with family members of the victims, journalists, and legal observers from around the world. Carmen and Roberto Martinez sat in the front row, holding hands and wearing small pins with Sarah's photo. They had waited years for this moment, hoping that justice might somehow ease their unbearable grief. The 4 defendants, Igor Girkin, Sergei Dubinsky, Oleg Pulatov, and Leonid Karchenko, were being tried in absentia, as Russia refused to extradite them and they remained at large. Only Pulatov was represented by lawyers who participated in the proceedings, while the others ignored the Dutch court entirely. Prosecutor Ward Ferdinandus opened the trial with a detailed presentation of evidence that had taken investigators years to compile. Using intercepted phone calls, satellite images, and forensic analysis, he painted a picture of a military operation gone wrong, where civilian aircraft became the unintended target of a surface-to-air missile system. The prosecution played audio recordings of conversations between the defendants in the hours leading up to the attack. In one particularly damaging intercept, Girkin could be heard discussing the need to bring down aircraft in the area. Another recording captured the moment when the operators realized they had shot down a civilian plane, with one voice saying, "This is bad. There were civilians on board." Sarah's story became a central part of the prosecution's case, not because she was more important than the other victims, but because her actions during the crisis illustrated the human cost of the defendants' actions. The prosecutors described how she had continued helping passengers, even as the aircraft was breaking apart, embodying the professionalism and courage of all the crew members who died that day. David Chen testified as a witness, describing Sarah's dedication to aviation safety and her love for her job. Through tears, he told the court about their plans for the future, their hopes of starting a family, and how her death had destroyed not just his happiness, but his faith in the safety of commercial aviation. His testimony was followed by dozens of other family members, each telling the court about their irreplaceable loss. Dr. Lang's daughter spoke about her father's lifelong commitment to fighting AIDS and how his research had been on the verge of a breakthrough that might have saved thousands of lives. Emma Backer's grandmother showed the court the child's drawing of the airplane, explaining how the 5-year-old had been excited about her first international flight and had spent weeks preparing for the family vacation. The defense lawyers argued that their clients had been fighting a legitimate military conflict and had mistakenly identified Flight MH17 as a Ukrainian military transport aircraft. They claimed the defendants had no intention of harming civilians and should not be held responsible for what they characterized as a tragic accident of war. However, the prosecution countered that the defendants had failed to take adequate precautions to identify their target before firing. International law requires combatants to distinguish between military and civilian targets, and the evidence showed that Flight MH17 had been clearly identified as a civilian aircraft on radar systems and air traffic control communications. The trial revealed disturbing details about the Russian military's involvement in the Ukrainian conflict. Prosecutors presented evidence that the Buk missile system had been transported from Russia specifically for this operation and had been operated by a mixed crew of Russian military personnel and local separatists under Russian command. Carmen Martinez was allowed to make a victim impact statement during the trial. Standing at the podium, she spoke directly to the empty defendants' chairs, her voice steady despite her grief. "You took my daughter from me," she said. "You took a woman who spent her life helping others, who made passengers feel safe when they were afraid of flying. You turned her workplace into a weapon of war." She continued, "Sarah died trying to help strangers in their final moments. She died doing her job, serving others even when she knew there was no hope. That's the person you killed. Someone who represented the best of humanity, destroyed by people who represent the worst. The prosecution also called aviation experts to testify about the broader implications of the attack. They explained how the downing of MH17 had fundamentally changed commercial aviation, forcing airlines to invest heavily in new intelligence systems to track conflict zones and avoid potentially dangerous airspace. One particularly powerful moment came when investigators played the final air traffic control recording from flight MH17. Captain Chu's calm, professional voice could be heard acknowledging routine instructions from Ukrainian controllers, completely unaware that a missile was streaking toward his aircraft at over 3 times the speed of sound. The trial also examined the defendants' attempts to cover up their involvement after realizing they had shot down a civilian aircraft. Phone intercepts revealed panicked conversations about removing evidence and creating false stories to blame the Ukrainian military. Social media posts showing the missile system being transported were hastily deleted, and witnesses were intimidated into changing their stories. Pulatov's lawyers argued that their client had been merely following orders in what he believed was a legitimate military operation. They claimed he had no knowledge that the target was a civilian aircraft and had trusted his superior's intelligence assessments. However, prosecutors demonstrated that the defendants had access to flight tracking information that clearly identified MH17 as a commercial flight. The emotional climax of the trial came when prosecutors played the victims' final phone calls and text messages. Several passengers had managed to send farewell messages to their families as the aircraft was going down, creating a heartbreaking record of their final moments. These messages were read aloud in court, bringing many observers to tears. As the trial progressed over many months, it became clear that this was about more than just individual accountability. It was a test of whether international law could provide justice for victims of state-sponsored terrorism, and whether courts could hold military commanders accountable for attacks on civilian aircraft during armed conflicts. The defense phase of the trial was limited, as 3 of the 4 defendants refused to participate in the proceedings. Pulatov's lawyers presented character witnesses and argued for his minimal role in the operation, but they could not overcome the overwhelming evidence of his participation in the conspiracy that led to the missile launch. On November 17, 2022, 8 years and 4 months after Sarah Martinez died in the sunflower fields of eastern Ukraine, the Dutch court delivered its verdict. In a packed courtroom filled with families who had waited years for this moment, the judges found Igor Girkin, Sergei Dubinsky, and Leonid Karchenko guilty of murder for their roles in shooting down flight MH17. They were sentenced to life imprisonment and ordered to pay millions in compensation to the victims' families. Only Oleg Pulatov was acquitted, with the court finding insufficient evidence that he knew the target was a civilian aircraft. The decision brought mixed emotions to the families: relief that most of the defendants had been held accountable, but frustration that justice remained incomplete as long as the convicted men remained free in Russia. Carmen Martinez sat in the front row as the verdict was read, tears streaming down her face. She had spent 8 years fighting for this moment, traveling repeatedly to the Netherlands, attending every hearing, and keeping Sarah's memory alive throughout the legal proceedings. When the judge pronounced the word guilty, she felt a mixture of vindication and emptiness. Justice had been served on paper, but her daughter was still gone forever. The court's judgment was comprehensive and damning. The judges found that the defendants had been part of a conspiracy to obtain and deploy a powerful anti-aircraft weapon system in a civilian area without taking adequate precautions to distinguish between military and civilian targets. They had created an unacceptable risk to civil aviation and bore responsibility for the deaths of all 298 innocent people aboard flight MH17. David Chen, now working as a flight safety instructor, watched the verdict announcement from his apartment in Kuala Lumpur. He had rebuilt his life in the years since Sarah's death, eventually marrying a fellow pilot named Lisa and starting a family. But he still kept Sarah's photo on his desk and spoke about her to his students when teaching them about aviation safety and the importance of protecting civilian aircraft from military threats. The verdict had broader implications beyond the specific case. Legal experts described it as a landmark decision that established important precedents for prosecuting those who attack civilian aircraft during armed conflicts. The court's reasoning made it clear that military commanders could not hide behind claims of mistaken identity when they failed to properly identify their targets. However, the practical impact of the conviction remained limited, as long as Russia refused to extradite the defendants. Gherkin had become a prominent military blogger and political figure in Russia, openly discussing his role in the Ukrainian conflict without fear of arrest. The other convicted men also remained at large, protected by a Russian government that continued to deny any responsibility for the tragedy. Sarah's parents established a foundation in her memory, focused on improving aviation safety and supporting families of aviation disaster victims. The Sarah Martinez Foundation worked with international organizations to develop better systems for protecting civilian aircraft in conflict zones and provided counseling services for families dealing with similar losses. The Foundation's first major project was funding advanced radar systems that could help air traffic controllers better identify and track military activities near civilian flight paths. Carmen Martinez often spoke at aviation safety conferences, sharing Sarah's story and advocating for stronger international protections for commercial flights. Emma Backer's family created a scholarship program for young women pursuing careers in aviation, inspired by Sarah's dedication to her profession. They wanted to ensure that other young girls could follow their dreams of flying, just as Emma might have done if she had lived to grow up. Dr. Lang's research on HIV treatment was finally published posthumously, with proceeds from the publication donated to AIDS research organizations. His work led to breakthroughs in treatment protocols that have since saved thousands of lives around the world, a legacy that emerged from the tragedy of his death. The crash site in Ukraine, once controlled by separatist forces, was eventually secured by Ukrainian government troops. A permanent memorial was erected there, listing the names of all 298 victims and featuring a symbolic broken airplane wing pointing toward the sky. Sunflowers, which had been growing in the field when the plane crashed, were planted around the memorial as a symbol of life persisting despite tragedy. Malaysian Airlines restructured its operations following the MH17 tragedy, implementing new intelligence gathering systems and route planning procedures to avoid potentially dangerous airspace. The airline also established a comprehensive support program for employees' families, recognizing that aviation workers face unique risks in their profession. Sarah's crew colleagues continued to honor her memory through their work. Many reported that they thought of her example during difficult flights, remembering how she had maintained her professionalism and care for passengers, even in the face of unthinkable horror. Her story became part of the training curriculum for new flight attendants, teaching them about courage under pressure. The international aviation community implemented significant changes in response to the MH17 tragedy. New systems were developed for sharing intelligence about conflict zones, and airlines invested heavily in real-time threat assessment capabilities. The goal was to ensure that no commercial flight would ever again unknowingly enter airspace where it could become a target. As the years passed, Sarah's story became part of a larger historical record about the human cost of armed conflict. Museums and educational institutions included her story in exhibitions about civilian casualties of war, using her example to illustrate how violence affects innocent people far from the battlefield. Carmen Martinez, now in her 70s, continued to visit the crash site in Ukraine annually when security conditions permitted. She would bring flowers and spend time in quiet reflection, speaking to Sarah as if she were still there. The local Ukrainian villagers had become like family to her, sharing in her grief and helping maintain the memorial site with remarkable dedication. During one visit in 2023, Carmen met Alexander, a local farmer who had been among the first to reach the crash site. He had kept a small piece of the aircraft's interior, a fragment with Malaysian Airlines logo, which he returned to her with tears in his eyes. "Your daughter was a hero," he said in broken English. "She died helping people. We will never forget her." The international legal battle continued even after the verdict. Lawyers for the victims' families pursued civil lawsuits against Russia itself, arguing that the state bore ultimate responsibility for providing the weapons and training that made the attack possible. These cases faced significant legal hurdles, as Russia claimed sovereign immunity and refused to participate in international proceedings. Meanwhile, the convicted defendants remained defiant. Gherkin gave interviews to Russian media, showing no remorse for the attack and continuing to spread propaganda about the conflict in Ukraine. His freedom served as a constant reminder that international justice systems had limitations when dealing with state-sponsored terrorism. Sarah's story took on renewed relevance as the world faced new conflicts and threats to civilian aviation. Her example of professionalism and compassion under extreme pressure became a touchstone for discussing how ordinary people respond to extraordinary circumstances. Flight attendants around the world knew her name and what she represented, the dedication to service that defines their profession. The Malaysian government eventually declassified Sarah's personnel file, revealing commendations for her work during previous emergency situations. She had helped deliver a baby during a flight over the Pacific Ocean, assisted in evacuating passengers during a severe storm landing, and received multiple awards for her customer service. Her final act of helping passengers during Flight MH17's last moments was consistent with her entire career. In 2024, 10 years after the tragedy, an international conference on aviation security was held in Sarah's honor in Kuala Lumpur. Delegates from dozens of countries gathered to discuss new technologies and protocols for protecting civilian aircraft. Carmen Martinez gave the keynote address, speaking about how her daughter's death had catalyzed important changes in aviation safety. The conference produced the Sarah Martinez Protocol, a set of international guidelines requiring airlines to share threat intelligence and coordinate route changes when military activities pose risks to civilian flights. While it couldn't bring back the victims of Flight MH17, it represented a concrete step toward preventing similar tragedies. David's daughter, born several years after Sarah's death, grew up hearing stories about the remarkable woman her father had loved. Though she never met Sarah, she felt connected to her memory and eventually decided to pursue a career in aviation safety, inspired by the example of courage and service that Sarah had set. The sunflower field in Ukraine, once a symbol of tragedy, gradually became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand the human impact of armed conflict. Visitors from around the world came to pay their respects, leaving flowers, notes, and personal mementos. The memorial grew organically, becoming a testament to the power of ordinary people to create meaning from senseless loss. As new generations learned about Flight MH17, Sarah's story served as a bridge between the technical details of the investigation and the human reality of the tragedy. She represented all the victims, people with dreams, families, and futures that were stolen in an instant by an act of violence they never saw coming. Her legacy lived on in the safety protocols that protected other flights, in the scholarship students who followed her path into aviation, and in the memory of a young woman who chose compassion over fear in her final moments. Sarah Martinez had been, as the title suggested, simply cabin crew, but in death she had become something more, a symbol of the best of human nature surviving even in the face of humanity's worst impulses. The story of Flight MH17 and Sarah Martinez serves as a permanent reminder that behind every statistic, every news headline, and every diplomatic crisis are individual human beings whose lives matter immeasurably to those who love them. Her courage, in those final moments, continues to inspire others to choose service over self-preservation, compassion over indifference, and hope over despair.